Welcome to Family Basics 101. I'm Dr. Bruce McClure, the local minister at the Prince George's Church of Christ, and we're located at 7800 Central Avenue in Landover, Maryland. This week, we focused on moving on. Today, I'd like for us to look at the topic of moving beyond online worship. It has been almost 2 years that, for the most part, churches around the country have had to modify their worship styles. And in a lot of ways, that has not been bad, but it has been, in a lot of ways, somewhat of an inconvenience, to say the least. But it has taught us so much over the past 2 years relative to online worship and how we can utilize technology for the good. Had it not been for online, had the technological advances not been in place, and we were still faced with the COVID pandemic, basically we would have been left out in the cold. But it seemed as if now many people are getting the vaccine. People are learning to better adapt to the environment that we're in. And even last Sunday, for the first time since right before Christmas, we actually worshiped back in the building. So let's talk about moving beyond, moving on away from online worship. Sometimes old habits and new habits are hard to break. And we just, as human beings, we can become comfortable with basically what we have to do. And one of the things that I hope we never do is become so comfortable with online worship that it becomes a substitute permanently for worshiping in the building with Christians. Now, let me be the first to say that never in my lifetime did I see home churching as being anything possible. I never foresaw a day where basically we would not be able to worship in the building. The purest years of Christianity, however, surprisingly, were pretty short. When you think about from AD 33, the beginning of Christianity, to about 100 AD, those were the purest years of New Testament Christianity. And the Dark Ages show up, and they are going to last quite a long time. A period of time from 500 AD to 1500 AD. And then we move back into the Enlightenment era. But there's a transition period. The period from 100 AD to 500 AD, when a major departure from the original church happened, and it was a period of apostasy or falling away. That's when that occurred. I call it going offline. And as the church went offline, they did not go into extinction. They were still online, but they went online in a different way. Large number of Christians, for fear of their very life, fell away from the truth of God's word and went further into apostasy or deeper into hiding and secret church assembly. See, going offline for the first century Christians, two reasons: fleeing persecution, but as they fled persecution, some people became so intimidated by the persecution that they fell into apostasy, which basically means they fell away from faith. But there were still people in the midst of the persecution that, although they went offline, they went online. And that's why I put in this presentation, they were hiding and they were still having secret church services, but not in the big house assemblies, not in the public assembly. And I would speculate that never in their lifetime did they expect to experience anything such as that. Now, when we look at the run-up to this secluded online type worship that the first century Christians experienced from 100 to 500 AD, it was predicted. It was actually predicted. And yet, when it came, there were many in the church that withstood it. When you read the text of Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3, and we look at those 7 churches at Asia, have you ever wondered, what is that conversation about? Why does God talk to them through John the Revelator about the church and the state of the church? Well, the true reason is this is the time period that the church was moving into apostasy because of persecution. So Revelation 2, verses 14 through 15, the church at Pergamos was sanctioning false religious teachers. See, they were drifting away, but they were acclimating to the times. They had 2 choices: drift away, acclimate to the times, or go offline, but stay online. Revelation chapter 2, verses 20 through 23, the church in Thyatira, the spirit of holy discernment to combat wrong and an increase in flagrant immorality was gone. See, they were offline. They were suffering, they were in persecution, but because we can't do where we normally do things does not mean that we just vanish and ignore what God has said. We can be in homes like we are now, offline, but never completely offline. Stay connected to God online. Revelation 3, verse 1, the church in Sardis was dead, but they thought they were alive. Revelation 3, verses 15 through 16, the church at Laodicea, remember, the King James said they were neither cold nor hot. They were neutral, but the engine was running, but they weren't moving forward. They weren't going backwards per se, but they just had their engines running. We can't be neutral. I see even in the time of COVID, and we're moving back online. But during this period, we can't just sleep in on Sunday mornings. We can't just ignore midweek Bible study. We can't ignore prayer life. We can't ignore the study of God's word. we can't ignore being a living testimony. Uh, in the church at Laodicea, they had just kind of become neutral, but they were dealing with persecution, just like the church at Sardis, just like the church at Thyatira, just like the church at Pergamos. But although we have to learn to worship in a different manner, that doesn't mean we give up and surrender and not worship at all. Alexander in 120 AD introduced the teachings that the practice of dipping one's hands in water and sprinkling it upon the person as they entered into the temple of the pagans, as if it was necessary because it made the water of baptism blessed and concentrated for their Christian religious purposes. That didn't come from God. That came from being offline. And many of the Christians fell into that, the falling away, the saying, well, because we are having to hide in worship, because we can't publicly assemble in worship, if this is what Alexander is decreeing, then we may as well get with the program. That should never be the case. This pagan ritual became the foundation upon which providing holy water for use to worship, even in church settings today. This is where it comes from. See, when we are in our second year of worshiping online, we should never, ever begin to substitute things while we are online. We should never begin to substitute things that are not permitted by God. Because when we come back really online, some people are going to struggle, because while they were offline from the public worship, and yet many things began to creep into, people, and I don't have a problem with this, 9 o'clock, hanging around in their loungewear, their pajamas, only God knows. But when we come back in the building, people shouldn't come dressed that way. Just so casual that you can't tell whether they're going to bed or coming to worship. We do coffee, we do donuts, we do cookies, and we allow that. But when people come in with their big breakfast, their IHOP meals in the morning time to worship, that's not proper, and people know that's not proper. But that's what they adjusted to doing while doing online worship at home. The church will withstand this online worship that we're having to do, because the church has withstood a lot over the years. The predictions of the dark eras, it was predicted. That's what the scriptures are indicating. Acts 20, 2 Peter, excuse me, 2 Peter chapter 2, Matthew chapter 24, 1 Timothy chapter 4. All of those were prophecies about what was going to happen, the falling away during that dark period. But always running contemporaneous with the church of the dark ages was the church of the first century. It never disappeared. It went offline, but it stayed online. The Jews of the first century couldn't put Christianity offline. Rome of the 2nd through 5th century couldn't put Christianity offline. And certainly during that period of the Dark Ages extended from 500 to 1500 AD, they never really put Christianity offline. Modified, yes, but Christianity has always stood the test of time. I'm convinced without a doubt that in the near future, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, 6 months, whatever the time frame, I am absolutely convinced that our modification of our worship environment, worshiping at home, doing Bible class at home, live streaming, YouTube, Facebook, the church's website, as the only way, I'm certain that that will come to an end in the near future. The near future, how do you define it? Well, the children of Israel dealt with things for years upon years upon years. Have you ever thought about this? What we're going through has been for 2 years. But the children of Israel stayed in Egyptian bondage for over 400 years. After coming out of Egyptian bondage, they wandered lost in the wilderness for 40 years. So what we're going through is only minute compared to what God's people have gone through. Let's be encouraged. And with great anticipation, let's keep moving toward going offline with this online worship, and with great expectation, looking forward to coming back online with the in-person assembly. I will see you back in class again Monday. Don't be late and don't skip class.